The modern American left is fascist. And again, the way I put it on this show is they're really fascio-Marxists. They're a little bit of a combination, of the two. Ideologically speaking, you cannot go in opposite directions and arrive at the same place. Therefore, this idea that somehow Nazism, fascism, is a manifestation of the right, it isn't. It's a manifestation of the left. I was just kind of sitting down and had on in the background, a documentary was playing on TV, and the documentary is called Living with Hitler. And while I'm reading something else, I heard this phrase, Hitler wanted to make Germany great again. What do you think the intention was of using a phrase like that in a documentary about something that occurred 80 years ago? Well, welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today we're going to be talking about a strategy, a long-term strategy that the left has been using, the global left, as it applies to Donald Trump, President Trump, and his supporters, the so-called MAGA movement, Make America Great Again crowd. And that has to do with the fact that there's very frequently employed, and this has been going on for years, the accusations that he's Adolf Hitler and that his followers are Nazis or fascists. And I want to deal with that because I think it's important that you understand, first of all, what fascism is and who the fascists really are. And again, I don't just want to use it in a sense of, the very casual way the currency is currently being used. And because those terms are used, those accusations are made so frequently, the result is that the accusations come to have very little meaning at all. I mean, everybody's a Nazi. I mean, you have the soup Nazi, and you have this person as a Nazi, and that person as a Nazi. But in this case, I think it actually matters quite a lot because there are people who are behaving genuinely, historically, like Nazis. And speaking as a historian, I kind of want to detail that for you today and explain what that looks like. But before we do that, I want to talk again. I want to revisit a subject of a previous episode. I think the previous episode of Ideas Have Consequences, and that's this woke right nonsense. First of all, I want to be very clear. The term is oxymoronic. It's silly. It's dumb. It is either a deliberate psyop to confuse people on the right as to what right and left really are, what conservatism actually is, or it's an unwitting psyop employed by people who just simply do not understand why this matters. And why I do think it matters is because I have been on long before this kind of idiotic terminology, self-contradictory terminology was being used. I've been on a kind of quiet and at times not so quiet mission to give clarity to the posse, to the fans of this show, as to what conservatism actually is. And in doing so, I've taken some heat because I was a very early critic, long before it became clear that she was off the rails as it is now. I was a critic of Candace Owens. And I was an early critic of Andrew Tate. And I was a critic of Russell Moore and of David French. And I have at times been a critic of Tucker Carlson. And again, the purpose of that isn't because I just want to be the guy who pretends to be, the gatekeeper for what is and isn't conservative, as though I myself am the embodiment of conservatism. It is rather because I have been very concerned that many people, conservatives and Christians, and not all conservatives are Christians, but conservatism, authentic conservatism, is derived from a Christian worldview, from a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I know some have taken exception to that term. I don't care. There is such a thing as Judeo-Christian. And what that simply means is that both Jews and Christians recognize the Old Testament as a source of their holy scriptures. Both of them do. Now, Jews don't acknowledge the New Testament and Christians do, but both Christians and Jews look to the Old Testament as a part of their holy canon. And when we talk about conservatism, when we talk about the West as we know it, it sprang from a Judeo-Christian Hebrew and Christian worldview. And by that, we mean specifically not just simply the whole Old Testament, but specifically the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. That's really what we're talking about. Western law, as we know it, didn't come from Hammurabi. It didn't come from Greek thought. It came from Hebrew thought. It came from Christian thought, and it came specifically from the Ten Commandments. And really the father of modern conservative thought is Edmund Burke, the silver-tongued Irishman, British parliamentarian, who's writing in the late 18th century, specifically as it regards the American Revolution and then later the French Revolution. He is really kind of the embodiment of modern conservative thought and thinking. And I just simply want to encourage people to be wary of attaching yourself unquestioningly to prominent personalities and thinking I'm all in on that. I'm all in on that. I have experienced, at times there are those within, say, the MAGA movement who would kind of hold me at arm's length because, you don't see me wearing the hat and you don't see me so much using the terminology. But it isn't because I'm not in on the agenda insofar as I understand it. I voted for Trump. I voted for him 3 times. I am very much on board with the agenda to the extent that I know it. But I, as a Christian, take very seriously the scriptural commandment, which says this, in Proverbs, it tells us this: turn neither to the right hand nor to the left, but avoid evil, that your foot avoids evil. And what I take that to mean is this, is that I'm all in, not on any specific political platform per se, definitely not Democrat, in part on Republican, but I take things one issue at a time. And I compare them to Scripture insofar as I understand them, if that makes some sense to you. So my constitution, my personal constitution, the constitution for every Christian should be Scripture itself. And the way you avoid your foot stepping into evil is that you compare the policies, the issues, the things that you encounter to what Scripture itself actually has to say regarding them. So because of that, while I have been a strong supporter of Donald Trump, there have been times where I've been very uneasy and indeed have criticized some of the things that he's done. Take, for example, the Republican National Convention, where at the RNC, he platformed a pro-abortion, unrepentant pro-abortion porn star. I'm not all in on that. I'm not in favor of that. I found that highly problematic. I'm not in favor of that kind of big tent. But again, the point that I'm simply trying to make here for you is that as Christians, and I am a Christian, and I know that many of you who follow this show are Christians, we're always evaluating the opinions, the ideas, the things that are being set forth in the culture and asking ourselves, is that Christian? Is that something I should be in favor of, or is that something that I should genuinely oppose? And that's no less than what the apostles themselves would do, and indeed would do to each other. So that you have in Galatians 2 this confrontation between Peter and Paul, and it's because Paul wasn't saying, hey, he's an apostle and gosh, he knew Jesus and I'm all in on everything Peter does. He didn't do that. He knew that Peter was a fallible man like the rest of us, and guess what Peter did in Galatians chapter 2? He sinned. And you go and read what happened on that particular occasion, but it was rather serious. And Paul said, I confronted him to his face. Well, that's what we have to do, with each other as it regards what we're talking about happening socially and politically. And with that in mind, when I see commentators who are saying things that I find very problematic while at the same time being hailed as, great conservative thinkers, or as individuals that I see that Christians and other conservatives are ready to latch onto and follow them, I get concerned because I can see that there is potential for those individuals to lead a lot of people, maybe millions of people astray. And the best example of this is Elon Musk. I was warning early on about Elon Musk, not because I didn't appreciate a number of things that he did, the restoration of something like free speech on Twitter, on X, as he likes to call it. And listen, Twitter isn't a free speech platform. It just isn't. I mean, even the CEO that he hired, who's has since resigned and moved on, but not because of this. Her first public statements when she went to work for Musk at Twitter, he must have been on board with this, was she said, freedom of speech, not freedom of reach, meaning she was acknowledging we do suppress certain content. And it's quite obvious there's still a lot of suppression going on that particular platform. That said, under Musk, it was greatly improved from what it had been under the previous regime, and he restored a number of accounts, President Trump being one of them, but along with a number of other conservatives who'd just been booted straight off the platform. And so I saw progress there, and I could certainly be grateful for some of the work that Musk was doing regarding Doge and this kind of thing. But I was also warning, and I took a lot of heat from people who watch this show and saying, I love Musk. Everything's great about Musk. And I'm saying, hold on, people. The guy is an atheist, at best an agnostic. He has no moral foundation for his worldview, none. And this is a guy who is trying to live forever by putting, with Neuralink and brain chips and transhumanism. I mean, he's all on board with that. He's also in favor of increasingly move us towards a surveillance state. And some people may say, well, no, he isn't. What do you think AI is being used for? What do you think Grok is doing on social media? They are gleaning massive and training artificial intelligence by gleaning your conversation. The information that you share on a platform like X, they are using it to train artificial intelligence. You've heard of predictive text. Well, they will be creating artificial intelligence that will make predictive moves, meaning predicting your behavior before you do it. This is Minority Report, kind of stuff. You should be deeply concerned by this. Doesn't mean that there aren't things that I appreciate about Elon Musk. I do. But I'm not all on board with everything that he does, and I take it one issue at a time. And I also warned that the guy is unstable. Well, that proved to be true as well. So again, when people were hailing him as though he was some sort of, a bright light of conservatism, I was saying, no, he isn't a conservative. He's anti-woke. And I'm always telling the posse, you need to make a distinction between what is conservative and what is merely anti-woke. Now, conservatism is, by definition, anti-woke. But not all people, not all ideologies that are anti-woke are conservative. Andrew Tate, a Muslim, sort of, he's anti-woke. He's not a conservative. I mean, the guy is an abuser of women. He's a human trafficker. He is absolutely full of himself, and he's been leading millions of young men straight off of a cliff, an ideological cliff. That's not conservatism. That's Islam. In no way, shape, or form is conservative. It isn't, not in the sense that we're talking about it here. I mean, it's fiercely anti-Christian and, again, by definition, anti-Semitic. That's what Islam is. We're not just talking about, prim behavior as being that's a wrong definition of what conservatism is. That's not what we mean here. Certainly not in a political sense. So again, Islam is anti-woke, but it's not conservative. So it's very easy for people to see people, public personalities, make anti-woke statements and then suddenly think he's on my team. And then what you discover when you start drilling down into the details, and the devil, as they say, is in the details, they discover, guess what? We diverge on quite a lot. And this was Trump's mistake. Trump made the assumption that Musk was all on board with everything related to his own agenda, and then discovered when he brought him into the inner circle, when he made him essentially a co-president of the United States, he discovered he'd made an enormous mistake because A, the guy is unstable, and B, because he realized he was on board with very little. Just listen to some of the things that Steve Bannon has had to say regarding Musk. You can go search that on social media and you'll see Bannon going on a tirade saying that it is his mission in life to destroy Elon Musk because he says Musk is a fraud. Now, I'm not going to go as far as saying something like that here. I'm just going to say that the guy is anti-woke, not conservative. And the same applies to figures like Candace Owens. The same applies to the pseudo-historian, Daryl Cooper, an anti-Semite and Nazi apologist that Tucker Carlson platformed not once but twice. And it's become increasingly clear, Tucker Carlson, someone that I have, very much appreciated in past, Tucker Carlson is not a conservative either. I think the discovery for Carlson that the United States government was conspiring against the American people throughout the Biden administration, and particularly as it related to infectious diseases, I think that jarred Carlson's kind of Boy Scout view of the world. And the result was it unhinged him. And he'd gone from, a reasonably, conservative worldview and interpretation of history to suddenly questioning whether anything was real. He suddenly just didn't believe anything at all. And that just keeps coming out, the further we go along. So again, part of what I want you to understand when I sort of laid out for you on the whiteboard, the political spectrum, what is right, what is left. Left meaning more government controls, and the further you move in that direction, the further you move towards tyranny, and right meaning fewer government controls, and the further you move that way, the further you move towards anarchy, is just a simple way for you to understand this. Now, some people get caught up with the visual representation of it, it being on a line, and shouldn't it be a horseshoe or shouldn't it be a circle? It's ridiculous. Don't get caught up in that. Ideologically speaking, you cannot go in opposite directions and arrive at the same place. You cannot. And therefore, this idea that somehow Nazism is a fascism, is a manifestation of the right, it isn't. It's a manifestation of the left. And let me give you an example of this, something that is, I feel like kind of my own sort of unique academic discovery. When I was when I was getting my degrees in history and I'm studying all these things, specifically Russian history, socialism, Marxism, all this stuff, all the isms, and at times hating it. The way this was taught, and this is a psyop, genuinely speaking, the left has never wanted to claim the horrors of Nazism. And the way they do that is, and it is, by the way, that's a manifestation of the left. And they know that it is, but they don't want to admit that to you. So they always say that fascism is a manifestation of the extreme right and try to keep their own, how shall I put it, their own worldview safe from association with genocide. Now, part of the problem with that is they fully embrace socialism, and somehow they don't seem that has an association with an even greater genocide, which is that of Stalinism. Communist regimes killed far more people than Hitler did. Not because Hitler wouldn't have killed just as many. His regime just didn't last as long. The Soviets were in power for 75 years, and Hitler was in power for about 13. So 12 and a half. So a shorter period of time. That's the only difference there. But that's the way it was always taught. So when I was in graduate school, they'd always speak, of fascism, Nazism is the expression of the extreme right, and Bolshevism or communism, Marxism is an expression of the extreme left. That's the way it was always put. But that's not true. They're both of the extreme left. And that's because the further you move left, the greater the government controls and the closer you get to tyranny. That's the easiest way to understand this. Just think of it like this. Think of it like an HOA. Some homeowners associations, if you're not familiar with the terminology, homeowner association, HOA, some homeowner associations function with a kind of laissez-faire sort of attitude. Live and let live. They have fairly minimal rules, and they just kind of want to maintain property values. They don't want somebody building a chicken house in the neighborhood, so they form an HOA to make sure that doesn't happen. And they want to make sure that somebody doesn't put a car without wheels on blocks in the front yard and thus make the whole neighborhood look trashy. But then other HOAs, they move further and further and further to the left, greater and greater controls. They start controlling the color of your house, the color of your door, the nature of your mailbox and its height, and the height of your grass, and what kind of shingles you can and can't have. And you got to get permission to do absolutely anything with your own property in your own home. And it is the tendency of governments, of ruling organizations of any kind, whether we're talking about in a school board, local government, state government, federal government, the people who run your corporation, your business, the places where you work, the tendency is to always move further and further to the left over time. It's just what happens. It's what we're seeing in American history. America was founded with this idea of to try to escape that. And it was founded with the idea that there are certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that belong to people. And this idea that you have personal liberties, personal freedoms, and up to a point, people really can't tell you what to do. But what has happened over the course of 250 years? Increasing government controls, increasing government regulations, so that we're moving towards a surveillance state. We are moving that way. The effort to do things like COVID passports, for example, or the new IDs that they want to use, and the continued discussion on the left to put a chip in everybody, that would make this is the kind of stuff that starts raising concerns and questions about what the book of Revelation talks about when it talks about, the sign of the beast, the mark of the beast. Some are saying, is that what this is? Is this what we're talking about? My friend, Professor John Lennox of Oxford University, is somewhat convinced. He doesn't state this with absolute certainty because none of us can know it with certainty, but that the beast may in fact be some kind of transhuman manifestation. But again, where your freedoms are pared down to where you have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer freedoms. You have less and less liberty. And a big, how do I want to put this? Excuse me. A way to think about this might be like this, that from the left's point of view, they believe that the laws, your freedoms, are defined and given by government. and that you can only do those things that are expressly stated in the law. This is contrary to an American spirit. It's also contrary to a Christian spirit. Conservatism believes that your rights flow from God, not from government. It is merely the role of government to acknowledge, not give, not grant, but to acknowledge those inalienable rights. That's what the Declaration of Independence is talking about. They're not talking about a government that gives you rights. They're saying we recognize that the British government's laws exist, but we're saying they're damnable laws because they violate the laws of God. We have certain inalienable rights, and you are violating them. So a conservative view, unlike a leftist view, which does not believe in God, a conservative view maintains that your rights come from God, they flow from God, and it is the role of government simply to acknowledge them, and that you can do anything that is not expressly forbidden by law. You see the difference there. So when I was talking about woke right in a previous episode of Ideas Have Consequences, it generated a lot of thoughtful chatter on YouTube and on social media. It got a lot of people thinking about this. And one of the things that people said who didn't agree with me is they said, you've misunderstood what is meant by woke right. I did not misunderstand what was meant by woke right. But anyway, they maintained you don't understand it because woke right simply means that there are people who are on the right but are prepared to use the tactics of the left, identity politics and things of this nature. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been at pains on this show to try to point out to you that the tactics you use, your means of achieving your end, define your end. If you're prepared to use, for instance, Democrats, sometimes when they say the quiet part out loud, and I'm going to put it more bluntly than any of them would dare say, but they essentially would mean this at the height of the rioting and statue toppling and these types of things, is they would say things like BLM and Antifa and rioting and burning of cities and intimidation tactics and restrictions on free speech and the rigging of elections and all that kind of stuff was really only for a short period of time. They don't really want that world. It's just what they felt it was necessary to do to stop Donald Trump, who they saw as who? Adolf Hitler. We have to use these kinds of tactics in order to prevent him from being reelected. And of course he was. We have to use these tactics for the short term in order to gain power and then to create the utopian state. The problem with that should be pretty obvious to you. If you are using terrorist tactics to achieve your ends, you're a terrorist. If you're using leftist tactics to achieve your ends that are supposedly on the right, nonsense. You're on the left. The moment you start using leftist tactics, you're on the left. That's why you can't say woke right. Those things are complete opposites. They go together like oil and water. They don't mix. Woke is by definition leftist. It is leftist. So if you say you're on the right and you're using woke tactics or woke language or woke strategies, I'm sorry, you're not a conservative. You're an idiot if you believe that. They do not go together. Your tactics define who you are. And a lot of people seem to think that the stuff that we were seeing from the left over the course of the last, really since Obama took office, but it's gained 2008, but it's since sort of, gained momentum. That stuff is just short-term strategy. No, it isn't. It is who you are. It's what you're about. And that's important to understand. So let me repeat. Your tactics, your strategies define who you are. Your means define your end. It tells us who you are. And it's why we have to be different. They don't respect the rule of law. We need to respect the rule of law unless those are laws, such as our founding fathers were pointing out with the Declaration of Independence, which are in conflict with God's laws. I will not acknowledge laws that are in conflict with, I don't care if abortion is legal or not. It's a damnable law anywhere that it's legal, because it's the taking of sacred human life, human beings that were made in the image of God. It's evil. So do understand that we believe as conservatives that our freedoms, our rights, as it were, they're bestowed upon you from above, not by the United States government, not by the British government, not by any government in the world. It is their job to acknowledge them. And when they do not acknowledge them, you have a right to defy them. That was really one of the great ideological, philosophical outcomes of the American Revolution, which George Macaulay Trevelyan, the late great English historian, pointed out wasn't a revolution at all. It was a civil war. It was the Second English Civil War. And why does he say that? Because he says revolutions seek the annihilation of everything in the past and charting a completely new course. Civil wars are different. The American Revolution, as my hero, Sir Edmund Burke, who I just referenced as essentially the father of modern conservatism, would point out, they weren't seeking the annihilation of all English tradition. They were, in fact, codifying it in American law. They kept a bicameral legislature, an upper and a lower house. They even kept the executive. They just did not want a monarch. We want an elected official. That's it. And they wanted to make sure that the laws applied equally to all people. And this really brings us to where Democrats are, doesn't it? Because we're going to find out if the law really does apply equally. Now, at the time of my speaking right now, we have all these huge revelations that are coming out about what the Hillary Clinton campaign did with the assistance, and maybe even really, I mean, who called the code red here regarding the Russia collusion narrative and Donald Trump? I think it's Obama. I think Hillary Clinton was more than happy to go along with it because she thought she was going to get the Oval Office as a result of it. And that's because we're talking about people here who have no moral fiber, no moral foundation. They're prepared to do absolutely anything to achieve power. And this kind of brings us back to the point that I'm making here about left and right. Their means define their end. Obama was prepared to do absolutely anything to stop Donald Trump, right up to creating an atmosphere of assassination. That's what they did. That's what happened in Butler. They don't regret that happened. They only regret that he missed. Or he didn't miss entirely. They only regret that it didn't result in a fatality of Donald Trump. But now we see all this coming out about the Clinton campaign, what they were doing. They were lying, they were cheating, they were attempting to steal an election from the American people. They were attempting to thwart the will of the American people by weaponizing the Justice Department, the FBI, with a complete, and destroy, by the way, a man. Not just his political future, but his whole life. And why? Because he was a threat, not to the American people, not to the rule of law, not to the Constitution. He was a threat to their path to power. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. So please understand that when we're talking about things like woke right or even alt-right, that was a complete psyop from the left, just as this whole idea that fascism and Nazism are on the right. The so-called alt-right, they're leftists. Look at their tactics. Look at their beliefs. Look at the way they think. And the woke right, so-called stupid term, there's no such thing. There is no such thing. Those are individuals who are on the left. So it's important that you get that. And it's important that you, again, to quote scripture here, you turn neither to the right nor to the left and keep your foot from evil. And the way you do that is to take things one at a time, one candidate at a time, one issue at a time, one statement at a time. I would encourage you to be Bereans, as the Apostle Paul, said to those people. He encouraged them to seek out whether what he was teaching them was biblical or not. They could go and read the scriptures for themselves. You say, well, how would they do that? The New Testament wasn't intact at that point. It hadn't yet been. They're looking at the Old Testament, to the Septuagint, and that's what Paul was preaching and teaching from. And that's what he encouraged them to do. I encourage you to do the same thing. I make no claims of infallibility here, none. I will from time to time get things wrong. And have. I have on occasion gotten things wrong. Last year, I was pretty sure that Michelle Obama was going to be the candidate when I was pretty sure they were going to force Biden out. They did. I was right about that. And then it was going to be to get Michelle Obama to run. I was wrong. I got that wrong. So it's important that you are searching the scriptures and that you're comparing the policies, the ideas, the things that you encounter in this world to what Scripture has to say. And it's worth saying this at this moment as it relates to this. Some people want to say to me, they come into the chat on social media or on YouTube or something, and they say, they make these silly comments about, that the show is political. Well, we talk a lot of politics here. And they say that's not Christian. You're very foolish if you believe that. I like what the 19th century statesman and theologian Abraham Kuyper said, and that's this, that there's not one square inch of human existence, of human endeavor, that Jesus Christ doesn't point to and say, that's mine. That includes politics, includes art, includes literature, includes the family, includes education. It includes your occupation. It includes all of that. Every sphere of human endeavor, Jesus Christ points to and says, that's mine. He doesn't look at politics and go, well, I've really nothing relevant to say about this. It wouldn't be Christian for you to involve yourself in these things. Ladies and gentlemen, we involve ourselves in them, and I feel passionate about them because societies, as Christians, we believe are changed one heart and soul at a time, right? That's what we believe. We believe it's a bottom-up transformation. It's the way the Roman Empire was transformed. That's the rise of Christianity in the West, right? And laws and governments taking on certain aspects that are quite Christian. As a result of that, the United States really being the greatest expression of that, even as far off the rails as we've gone. The certain aspects of that remain true. The presumption of innocence, for example, is an example of that. But we involve ourselves in these things because from the top, it isn't that when we say that societies are transformed bottom up, one heart and soul at a time, that we're saying that top down is irrelevant or what's happening at the top doesn't matter. We don't involve ourselves in that. No, you should involve yourselves in it. You should exercise the rights that you have to vote, to participate in a political system. Not just that alone, but that should be part of your Christian endeavor. And one of the reasons why is because we as Christians, we're to have a really deep concern for the voiceless, for the weak, for those people who can't defend themselves. Who would that be? Unborn children, little children, adolescents who are being mutilated. Those people are being just absolutely steamrolled. I would say the common people throughout the Western world being steamrolled by elitists. That should concern you. And you have an opportunity to participate in the political process and change those things. You do that. So, yes, Jesus Christ has something to say about politics too. And that will make some of you uncomfortable, but it's real and it's true. And I will add this, the claim that Jesus Christ has nothing to say about politics, they never put it that way. It's just that's just the natural, logical outcome of the argument. It almost always is being championed by two aforementioned people, Russell Moore and David French and others like them, who are among the most political people. And I would suggest to you that neither of them are actually Christians. If they're offended by that, happy to have you on the show. Love to debate either one of you on the theological underpinnings of the arguments that I see that you make from time to time. But all of that said, they tend to be people who are incredibly political. They just don't want you to be political. And that's because they fear the way you're going to vote or participate in the political process. They're pushing every kind of leftist agenda, and they don't want you opposing it. So they tell you, you know what? The church, Christians really shouldn't be a part of this. You need to stay out of the argument. Jesus would not have us involving ourselves in such trifling matters. It's not true. I also think that some people who argue that Christians should stay out of the political process are cowards. It's their way out. They don't want to take a stand for anything, so what do? They just simply check out of the conversation. They don't want to take a stand for the unborn. They don't want to take a stand on immigration. They don't want to take a stand on Marxism. They don't want to be bothered with it. They want to live in a cone of silence. That's cowardly. It's also a dereliction of duty. Now, having said all of that, and thank you for tolerating my tirade. I'm very passionate as it relates to this. It's a nice segue into something else that I want to talk about, and that's this whole idea of fascism, of Nazism, and that this is something that the left is promoting big time, is to be associated with Donald Trump. Now, where this really popped on my radar, again, I mean, it's been on my radar for more than a decade, but when it really popped up on my radar recently is I was just kind of sitting down and had on in the background, a documentary was playing on TV. And the documentary is called Living with Hitler. And while I'm reading something else, I heard this phrase: Hitler wanted to make Germany great again. Now, what do you think the intention was of using a phrase like that in a documentary about something that occurred 80 years ago? Well, quite clearly, there was a modern political motivation in producing the documentary in the first place. It wasn't just to educate you about Nazism or World War II or Adolf Hitler or the way the fascists seized government and plunged the world into a world war that would take the lives of 50 to 55 million people. That wasn't the purpose. I realized, I looked up at the screen and I thought, that's so interesting. This woman, I think her name is Lisa Pine, who's a historian. And otherwise, some of the things that she said I thought were quite good and insightful, but she was using that language, and they made a point of putting it at the front end of every episode. There are 3 episodes in this series, Living with Hitler, and that quotation from her is the one that they use as a promo to hang the entire series on that, to hinge it on that. Because the producers of that, and clearly she did too, they want you, without Donald Trump's name is never used. MAGA is never mentioned in any of those 3 documentaries, but they want you to think of him. And so I picked up my phone and I looked up on IDB to see when the documentary was produced. And guess what? It came out just before the 2020 election. There was absolutely a motive in doing that. Again, not to educate you about Hitler, but to make you afraid that Donald Trump was a new Hitler. And the people who followed him, they're just as bad as any Sieg Heiling, fascists from 1930s and 40s Germany. That's what they were trying to do. And I thought, you know what? It would be fun to talk about this on an episode of Ideas Have Consequences so that you guys can kind of connect those dots and see how they do it. But more than that, I'm just going to state straight out what they did not have the courage to say in that documentary. They clearly want you to believe Donald Trump is Hitler, but they didn't say it. I want you to understand that the American left, they are fascists. They are fascists. The modern American left is fascists. And again, the way I've put it on this show is they're really fascio-Marxists. They're a little bit of a combination, of the two. So let's take a little trip down memory lane. Now, here is a magazine cover. I've showed this to you before. This is the New Republic. And what do they have on the front here? They say American fascism, what it would look like. Now, this came out prior to last year's election, presidential election. And this is their way of instilling fear. They're trying to condition the American people, the American voter, to fear Donald Trump and his supporters, to fear that this is a rise of some kind of new fascism. A new Hitler era is on the way. And they have this ridiculous image on the cover. Now, by the way, I think they vastly overplay their hand. But what this looks like to me is a kind of argument where your opponent, knowing they're losing, becomes more and more shrill. The left no longer, for years this has been true, they don't want to engage in the realm of ideas. They don't actually want to have real debate on real issues. They want to shut you down. They want to make sure that you're not heard, and they want to smear you. That's what they want to do. And that's what's going on here. Do they actually want to have a real discussion as to what fascism is and who Hitler was and which party looks more like them? No, they just want to smear. And so here you have. So this ridiculous image where they have made Donald Trump look like Hitler. It's kind of this computer generated kind of thing. Then you have here's another headline, NBC News. Harris says Trump is increasingly unhinged and blasts his reported praise of Hitler as dangerous. Where in the world did Donald Trump ever praise Adolf Hitler? Well, of course, he didn't. But the headline, they know that most people don't read articles. The headline here, again, is meant to smear. It's meant to associate. And by the way, I do want to say this. This is something else that you should be careful of. I have never liked, whether it's being used against Obama, someone I can't stand, or it's being used against Donald Trump, or anyone else for that matter, I have never liked guilt by association. Guilt by association is just simply wrong. That, you have a picture of, let's say, Donald Trump with Jeffrey Epstein. Or you have a picture of Obama with Jeffrey Epstein. Or you have a picture of Obama with, Saul Alinsky, or something like that. That never happened, but he was definitely influenced by him. That proves nothing. I cannot tell you the number of people that I've stood next to warmly in photographs who I know nothing about. Or I'm just being friendly with them. And, if I'm at the White House and Obama was, there was an opportunity for a photo there, sure, I'll stand next to him and get a photograph. It doesn't mean I'm on board with what he stands for or even know what he's up to at a personal level. So guilt by association, just because you see photographs of people together, that proves nothing. Now, that can become evidence of something. If someone says, these people didn't actually even know each other or hang out, well, we have a photo here. They actually did. And there's another reason to be wary of it, by the way. And that's because we are now in the era of AI, where stuff like this can be generated falsely very, very easily. And you're going to see more and more of that, of individuals being smeared falsely. And we're probably going to get to a point where you can't tell the difference between, forensically. I know the viewer won't be able to tell the difference, but I mean, even people trying to break it down technologically to find out if it's AI, I think we're going to get to the point where you can't tell any of that. Then you have the Atlantic's Anne Applebaum on October 19, 2024, with this headline: Trump is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. If you watched an episode of Ideas Have Consequences, I think it was last month, where I had Data Republican here in the studio, I asked her this question: who have you been really surprised to discover is really, really sinister? And she said, Miss Applebaum, which really surprised me. Not because I thought she was wonderful, but I was sure she was going to name some figure of a much higher status. But she says, no, her. You can go and watch that episode. But here you have her saying, in this Atlantic headline, Trump is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. I mean, this headline is actually funny. No longer satisfied to say he's Hitler, they're now saying he's the trifecta of evil. He's all three of them rolled into one. 5 days later, USA Today ran this headline. Listen to this. No, the Atlantic didn't publish a story with headlines saying Trump is Hitler. Just in case you missed it, going back to the Atlantic's headline 5 days earlier, Trump is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. And USA Today came out 5 days later and said, no, fact check. No, the Atlantic didn't publish a story with a headline stating Trump is Hitler. Now, this shows you how dishonest media is. Technically speaking, USA Today is correct. They didn't say he was Hitler. They said he's speaking like Hitler. Do you see how the way the fact checks work? The fact checks are used to debunk reality and put you in a kind of house of mirrors where reality is distorted entirely. This was meant to make it sound like, no, we never said anything like that. No, you did say that. You didn't say it exactly like that. This is like, when you're a kid and you're trying to parse words because you're trying to get away with something. Your mom asks you, did you wreck the car last night? Are you the one who put the dent in the car? And you can find some technical way of answering the question with a no, but you know that you're actually deceiving your mother in answering the question. How many times have we all done that? But see, this is now the modus operandi of the left. This is the way they operate in media all the time. They're just lying, and it's all meant to deceive. Another headline, Huffington Post: Trump insists, I'm not Hitler. But social media has other thoughts. This is another way that the left is dishonest. They use social media. They find someone who says something they agree with, which of course is easy to do on social media, and they build a whole story around it and make it sound like this is mainstream thought. Everybody thinks Trump is Hitler. I mean, it's all over social media. By Trump denying, you have to forgive me, but when I had my accident years ago, my vocal cords were damaged. And one side of my vocal cords are permanently paralyzed. And as the day goes on, I begin sort of to lose my voice. And so I apologize for that because I'm clearing my throat constantly today. Another sip of coffee. By Trump insisting that he's not Hitler, this is the old trick of saying, when did you stop beating your wife? The question is framed to make you guilty. Nothing you can say will exonerate you. You'll just look more guilty in saying it. And then we have another headline from the Washington Post. Yes, it's okay to compare Trump to Hitler. Don't let me stop you. So you see how the left has worked here. Now, this is not new to you. You all are aware that these accusations are leveled constantly. But what I want to do now is say to you that all of this applies to the left. I derailed myself earlier. I told you that there had been something of a discovery that I felt like was sort of uniquely mine. And then I didn't actually state that to you, and I'll state it to you now. As I have said, fascism is a manifestation of the political left. It's not a manifestation of the right. And communism, Marxism, socialism is also a manifestation of the political left. But when I first started going to communist countries or formerly communist countries, I made an interesting observation. And particularly as it applies to China, Vietnam, and Russia. Not Cuba, because Cuba is thoroughly communist. But China, Vietnam, and Russia, I realized that they were now fascist countries. And they had it was like communist countries at the most mature stage, according to Marx. Socialism, as it matures, it would eventually achieve this kind of socialist utopia called communism. Technically speaking, communism has never been achieved. The way we use communism these days, we use communism and Marxist. We generally use them somewhat, interchangeably. But I realized that not only was Marx wholly wrong, that they didn't mature and achieve some kind of utopia, but that as socialist states, communist states matured, they eventually became fascist. Fascism is the most advanced stage of communism, of socialism. Either that or they die. And the reason is because of this. Socialist Marxist economics crater a country. But the tyrants, the oligarchy in power, in order to avoid revolution, in order to avoid being overthrown, to avoid becoming a vassal state of the West, of imperialist, of capitalist West, what they do is they in a desperate state to remain in power, they begin to loosen the communist economic policies to allow a measure of private property and capitalist elements, but where it's still controlled by the state. That is fascism. That's what fascism is. ESG, DEI, that's all fascism. So in fascism, you have private property. In Marxism, you do not. In fascism, your private property corporations are controlled by the state and usually geared for war. In this case, war against domestic populations. And in Marxism, the means of production, property is all owned by the state, you see. So what began happening was in China, recognizing that they're on the verge of their own kind of collapse, the way the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, they began loosening their restrictions, economic restrictions, in adopting Western policies and characteristics. Not wholly, because they were combining a kind of free market economy, capitalism, with a dictatorship, with tyranny. But they were seeking to do that, and they've achieved that. And when I realized this, of course, is when I began, I'm making trips to these countries, and I realized there's Lamborghini, there's Ferrari, there's McDonald's, there are all these things, and I'm seeing people, at least in the city centers where there's money, who are wearing the latest fashions. That there had been a huge change from the communist era to now they had become fascist. They had become fascist, and that's what we're seeing happening, in Western democracies that were never communist, but they began adopting increasingly fascist strategies in order to maintain power and in order to restrict the civil liberties of people and to achieve their own socialist utopian state. This is part of the goal. So they morph into becoming fascist states, which is quite interesting. But the reason I mention it is because it wasn't as though, to just by way of simply demonstrating to you that communism and fascism are not on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. The way a communist state becomes a fascist state is it's easy. It's a very short step. It wasn't a wholesale abandonment of their ideology where they went to the other end of the ideological spectrum. No, it was just a short step. It only meant making some minor tweaks in the tyrannical system in order to achieve it. And in the West, we're seeing those kinds of tactics. As I say, ESG and DEI, that's what they are. The strict regimentation of the economy. Yeah, there's private property ownership, but a strict regimentation of the economy beneath government control. The whole purpose of the ESG was to bring one at a time the reins of American corporate might into the hands of the left, where they controlled your boards, they controlled your messaging, they control your advertising. That's why the left has gone completely bonkers, in part over the Sydney Sweeney American Eagle ads, because they realize their messaging is dead. They have lost. They have lost because a company said, no more. We're not towing the ideological line anymore. We're going to go our own way, and we're going to try to make money. And that means we don't want fat, ugly chicks wearing our jeans. And that's why the left has gone, they're trying to cancel American Eagle in order to bring them back under the ESG umbrella, the DEI umbrella, to say, no, you cannot stray from towing the ideological line. You have to do as you're told. And that means no pretty women, white women, advertising your products. We need a fat lesbian or someone doing it. That's what's going on there. And so increasingly, American corporations, you're going to see in the next few years, more of them breaking ranks and saying, we're no longer doing that. We're already seeing cracks in that dam. But in other ways, how are they in other ways? How's the left, and not just the American left, but the global left, how are they like the Nazis? Well, there's a number of ways that they're like the Nazis. First of all, they create certain symbolism that they require that you acknowledge. Now, we all are familiar with the Sieg Heil. We're all very familiar with the Nazi salute. But the left has their own version of the Nazi salute, the rainbow flag. They have their own version of the Nazi armbands, pushing for, your signaling in your social media with things like Ukraine flags and rainbows and all these kinds of things. What are some other ways? Well, the requirement of essentially a kind of COVID passport in the Biden administration where you couldn't get a job, or perhaps you lost your job if you did not submit to the jab. Not making a comment here as to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of vaccines. That's a whole different conversation. I'm just simply saying that the left wanted to rob you, wanted to deprive you of your right, of your liberty to choose whether you do or don't take a vaccine. Going in or out of any country, they required that you have it. This was all a requirement. That's very fascist. That's extremely fascist. 1/3 of teachers, when Hitler came to power in 1933, 1/3 of them were purged from the school systems. That's very much like what we've seen from the left. When the left is talking about defund the police, when the left is talking about new curricula and this sort of thing in schools, what they want to achieve through that is they want to get rid of the old guard. They want to create intolerable circumstances in police departments as well as in the military, where the old guard, and by the way, there are no more conservative institutions historically in the United States than police departments and the military. They're historically very, very conservative institutions. The left knows that. And the left knew that they had to have control of both because they're instruments of coercion. They're instruments of control. It's the way you intimidate and cow a people. And by way of just an example, in my home state of Alabama, you had several police and sheriff's departments that during lockdowns, they came out and said, this is unconstitutional and we won't enforce it. We won't do it. The whole defund police movement was intended to get rid of people like that who go, gosh, I'm just taking early retirement. I'm getting out of here because I can't stand, what's going on. And how many people left the military? How many people left police departments, sheriff's departments during that period of time precisely because of that? And then they replaced them with individuals who are, if you want to call them woke, individuals who are willing to take their marching orders from the left and who would enforce anything. That's why they also want to deputize. It's why they also want to make them illegal aliens part of the military and police forces, because they know those are individuals who won't question. And they certainly won't have any problem with enforcing things that are contrary to the Constitution, because they're not Americans. They don't understand our country. And by the way, when we're talking about illegals, when we're talking about immigrants, this sort of thing, I said in a previous episode that has since, has over 100,000 views. We did just a couple of weeks ago on a biblical view of immigration. And I cannot tell you the number of silly people that I've seen who've come in to the chat or elsewhere on social media who claim Jesus was an immigrant. Jesus was not an immigrant. He was not an immigrant. Throughout the whole of his earthly ministry, he was within the Roman Empire. The entire time, he never left it. If he had, then he would be an immigrant. He did go from one country to another. Went to Egypt, and of course, he was in Judea. But that was all governed by the Romans. He was within the Roman Empire throughout his entire earthly ministry, and as a result, no time was he an immigrant. But you know who was an immigrant? Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was an Austrian who wanted to run for the presidency, run as chancellor, run for public office in Germany, but he couldn't do it because he was Austrian. You had to be German. And guess what? February 26, 1932, Hitler became a German citizen so that he could run for public office. Now, is that happening in the United States right now? You better believe it is. It's how we end up with Ilhan Omar's, and suddenly the guy's gone straight out of my head, but the guy running for mayor of New York. Those are individuals that hate America, but they want to have power over American people and access to American might and American money. They have no respect for American legal tradition or for our Constitution. And Hitler didn't for the German people. So if you want to talk about, migrants, Jesus wasn't one of them. Hitler was. What are some other ways that we see similarities between the left and between the fascists, between the Nazis? Forced sterilization. Interestingly enough, in the same documentary, again, Living with Hitler is the name of it, you have this. Now, again, this came out just prior to the election, the presidential election in 2020. So the historian who made this comment didn't know what was coming under the Biden administration. But this is what he says. He's talking about forced sterilization under Adolf Hitler, under the Nazi regime. And he says this: children were taken out of schools and hospitals and sterilized without parental permission. Now, how do you do that? How do you get the medical profession to accept that? And this is part of the tragedy of Nazi Germany. It couldn't have been done without the willingness of the medical profession to work on that demand. The producers of that film and that historian are rightly expressing their horror at the historic tragedy, the historic evil, the historic crime of sterilizing Jews against their will, of sterilizing Jewish children without consent of the parents. And yet, California has been doing exactly the same thing. And yet the Biden administration was pushing for that all over the place. Was it specifically targeting Jews? No. It wasn't specifically targeting Jews. That is the Biden administration. They're targeting who? They're targeting conservatives. Of course, what was driving all of this with the Biden administration was a sordid sexual agenda. And guess what? As William Shirer, the author of Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, points out, most of the early Nazis were, and I quote, sexual perverts. Now, that will probably be removed from future editions, of the book. But Shirer, who, to my knowledge, I don't know that he had any particular religious sentiment, and he certainly, I wouldn't say, was a strong conservative. He would be, I guess, probably by modern standards. But Shirer, as a historian of that particular epic, seminal work, is pointing out that there was a connection between the sexual perversion of the Nazis and their latter, behavior, their cruelty, and so forth. There is yet another similarity with the global left, with the American left, with what we are seeing from Democrats. Another thing that we see between them, both of them trying to create one-party states. The left wants to create a one-party state here, just as the left has managed to create it in Europe. There's the illusion of multiple parties, but there really isn't. It simply does not exist. I'll also say that we have seen a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, a shocking surprise in anti-Semitism throughout the West, and particularly we see it on social media. This, again, is being driven by the left. And, of course, the Nazis were anti-Semitic. They're also racist. The left likes to pretend that they're not racist. They are absolutely racist. And it really needs very little commentary from me to point out to you that, of course, the fascists, the Nazis, were themselves racist. They encouraged Germans to report on one another. This is also a tactic of the left. Throughout, COVID, you were seeing some local governments, some state governments, and even the federal government encouraging people, both in this country and in other countries throughout the West, to report on other people. Is someone outside? Take a picture, take a video, send it in. Is someone violating the lockdowns? Is someone violating one of the many rules? What that does is it creates suspicion and it sows seeds of division among a population when individuals are encouraged to report on one another. That's problematic. Pagan. The entire Hitler regime was riddled with pagan symbolism. Doesn't mean that they were actually practicing pagans. Adolf Hitler was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in any God. But he did like, and that's because he was a huge fan of Richard Wagner. He loved the Wagnerian operas, the Germanic myths, and he loved the symbolism and the emotional power that they evoked, and they incorporated them into their own symbolism, into their own, Nuremberg rallies, and things of this nature. There was a strong sense of paganism. And some of you have taken, exception to this and said, people have come again into the chat and say that they're pagan. I don't take that particularly seriously. I'm not sure that most people have any idea of what that really means. But when we're talking about paganism here, what I mean is pre-Christian religion that tends to be animistic, that tends to be earth worshiping. And the left has always had that element of paganism in there. And quite naturally, as an outcome of that, they are, like the fascists, they are anti-God. They are, as Romans 1 would put it, haters of God, and they sought the destruction of the church. Now, some people have said to me, Christopher Hitchens, when I debated him publicly, and you can find this, on my channel, our debate, he went on to say that the Nazis, took an oath to God and to Adolf Hitler, and that Hitler himself made numerous references, to God. Well, historian Alan Bullock, who's one of the premier historians and biographers of Adolf Hitler, he said this, because there are always silly people who want to argue that Adolf Hitler was a Christian. Adolf Hitler wasn't a Christian. He wasn't religious. In Hitler's eyes, Christianity was a religion fit only for slaves. He detested its ethic in particular. Its teachings, he declared, was a rebellion against the natural law of selection by struggle and the survival of the fittest. Taken to its logical extreme, Christianity would mean, this is a direct quotation, would mean the systematic cultivation of the human failure. From political considerations, he restrained his anti-clericalism, seeing clearly the dangers of strengthening the church by persecuting it. Once the war was over, he promised himself he would root out and destroy the influence of Christian churches, but until then, he would be circumspect. And then Bullock goes on to say, there's no evidence to substantiate the once popular belief that Hitler resorted to astrology. He was a rationalist and a materialist with no feeling or understanding for either the spiritual side or human life or its emotional, affective side. And Joachim Fest, yet another eminent biographer of Adolf Hitler, says this. Well, hold on. He says this. I think it's on page 280. Yes. As with Hitler's protestations of belief in tradition and conservative values, or even in Christianity, the socialist slogans were merely movable ideological props to serve as camouflage and to confuse the enemy. They could be changed or rearranged depending on the situation, meaning that Hitler was quite prepared, like the American left, to make appeals to religion and to make appeals to God always harnessed to his own political aim, meaning he was misquoting it the way when we were looking back a couple of episodes ago, the left was misquoting Scripture to justify an open borders agenda. Scripture doesn't justify that, but you can cherry pick verses and twist them to create the meaning you want. And this is exactly what Hitler and his regime did, because they knew that there was a strong Christian sentiment among elements of the German population, and they wanted to deceive them. Say what you have to do to get them on board. This is Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi claiming they're Catholics, while at the same time going against a key Catholic doctrine, pro-life. I mean, you had Nancy Pelosi being censured by the Catholic Church for her pro-abortion, and they're not pro-choice, they're pro-abortion, they're pro-death policies. There was nothing Catholic in what Joe Biden did, but some people will go, well, he's a Catholic. In what way is he Catholic? Not in any meaningful way that I know of. But he would claim it because he knows it's to his political advantage to do it. And this is what the left does. It's exactly what the fascists themselves did. As I close this particular episode of Ideas Have Consequences, part of what I'm trying to do here, ladies and gentlemen, is I really want to equip you to give you a lens through which to interpret the socio-political landscape, any given thing. I want to give you the tools so that you yourself can make determinations regarding the things that are happening, in the broader culture, to make wise determinations concerning them. And that's why I find it disconcerting when people who I know are Christian or who I know are conservatives who latch on to figures who are not. Doesn't mean that truth that's spoken by anyone is still truth. I mean, Balaam's ass, Scripture tells us, spoke truth. But the problem is, I find that people have a tendency not to take things one at a time, but to latch on to a particular personality because they like that person and then just sort of accept whatever comes from them must be the truth. And we can't do that. We have to take things one at a time and to make evaluations and decisions regarding them one at a time, where we then bring it back and we compare that with Scripture to know whether or not that actually it's a Christian worldview. Just because somebody's using scripture doesn't mean they're rightly dividing the word of truth. And the left, by the way, loves to do that because they know that most people who call themselves Christian are really just Christian-ish. They don't really know their Bibles. Most people who call themselves conservatives, whether they're Christians or Jewish or non-religious, don't really even know what conservatism is. So when someone comes along who is anti-woke, so many people are prepared to jump on that bandwagon and follow them because they're a celebrity. Be careful, be wise as it relates to these things. The scripture says, be as wise as serpents and meek as doves. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.